Okay, here's a question for you. What if a lot of what we think we know about, well, one of history's most pivotal figures, Jesus, what if it's not the whole story? That's exactly what we're getting into today in this deep dive. We're going to explore, did he actually live? What might his life have really been like?
And how did the narrative we have today actually evolve? It's a fascinating journey.
It really is. And the sources we're drawing on are pretty interesting too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've pulled together insights from a project exploring Jesus, Myth, Messiah, or Essene project.
Yeah.
It gets into things like apocryphal gospels, Jewish mystery cults, a bit of esotericism, even occultism.
Well, okay.
And it also builds on earlier research from a book called The Evolution of the Afterlife in Ancient Times. So that brings in context from Christianity, sure, but also Babylonian beliefs, ancient Egypt, Zoroastrianism, a really broad scope.
Got it. So our mission for you listening today is basically to unpack all these different layers, the historical, the theological, the mythological stuff surrounding Jesus.
Exactly. We want to uncover some perhaps surprising facts, maybe challenge a few long-held assumptions.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to getting really well informed on what's, let's face it, an incredibly complex and fascinating subject, giving you different ways to look at it.
Couldn't have said it better.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's unpack this.
All right.
So when we think of Jesus, the word Messiah just jumps out. But how did that idea, the concept of a Messiah, actually change over the centuries before Jesus even arrived? What did it originally mean?
That's a crucial starting point. Because the meaning shifted, like, dramatically. If you look back at the Old Testament, you find maybe 39 references to a figure who could be the Messiah.
Okay.
But here's the thing. Initially, Messiah just meant a king, a new leader, specifically from David's lineage. There wasn't really anything about special miracles or supernatural powers. It was very human, political, almost.
Oh, human leader. So how do we get from that to the sort of supernatural divine figure we often think of now? What caused that shift?
Well, a big part of it was the changing political reality for the Jews, especially under the Roman Empire. Things got worse. They didn't have their own king, no autonomous region.
Right, they were occupied.
Exactly. And as different sects popped up, Gnostics, mystery schools, and so on, the idea of the Messiah started to transform. Faced with Rome's immense power and their own communities fragmenting, many began to feel the Messiah had to be supernatural.
Because a regular human king couldn't possibly take on Rome.
Precisely. A human leader just seemed inadequate against a global empire. So you see this feedback loop, right? Political hardship kind of fuels the yearning for a divine, powerful intervention. When earthly solutions fail, people look upwards.
Makes sense. And it wasn't purely internal factors driving this change, was it?
Yeah.
You mentioned other cultures influencing Jewish thought.
Oh, absolutely. Jewish culture, while unique, wasn't, sealed off. They absorbed ideas. During the Persian period, you see influences from Zoroastrianism. Then the Hellenistic period brought Greek ideas. And later, under Roman rule, Latin influences and things like Mithraism played a role. These external concepts gradually meshed with Jewish beliefs, shaping what they expected from a future redeemer.
So religious ideas aren't static. They kind of borrow and adapt from what's around them.
Exactly. They're porous. It creates this much richer, more complex picture of belief over time.
Okay, so fast forward. You've got these heightened supernatural expectations building up for a Messiah. How did Jesus' actual appearance, his early life, stack up against that? Because it sounds like it wasn't quite the grand entrance some were hoping for.
Yeah, it's a real paradox, isn't it? Despite these evolved expectations for a divine king, not all Jewish communities were convinced Jesus was the one. Some apparently even tried to have him executed.
Really?
Yeah, he didn't show up with angelic legions or anything like that. Instead, the image presented was, well, poor and powerless. And he didn't seem to tick all the prophetic boxes, like being named Emmanuel, which means God is with us. That name isn't actually in the earliest gospel accounts.
That's a huge contrast to how Christian tradition portrays his birth, right? That narrative is very much about the miraculous.
Oh, completely. Christian sources paint a picture of a miraculous birth, no human father, conceived via the Holy Spirit. And they talk about 3 astrologers or kings from the East coming to confirm him as the Messiah, even as a baby.
And this idea of a fatherless birth, divine conception, that wasn't actually a completely new idea in the ancient world, was it?
No, not at all. That concept was pretty familiar in other mythologies. Think about the Zoroastrian figure, Soshant. He was also expected to be born without a father.
Interesting.
So it suggests that maybe the claim of Jesus' miraculous birth wasn't necessarily shocking to Jewish ears at the time. Perhaps it was even seen as dismissible, like, oh, another one of those stories, because it fit a known mythological pattern.
So what seems unique to us might have just been a recurring theme back then.
Possibly, yeah. It places it in a broader context of ancient religious storytelling.
Which definitely raises the question, was this miraculous birth story something that developed while Jesus was alive? Or was it something his followers crafted later, after his death, maybe to elevate his status? Especially since, as you said, Jewish communities at the time didn't seem to widely accept that level of grandeur.
That's right at the heart of what this material explores. And you have to remember, during Jesus' time, there were quite a few individuals in Judea claiming to be messiahs or prophets. He wasn't the only one making such claims.
Right.
And naturally, each community probably expected the real messiah to come from their own group, making them inherently skeptical of outsiders.
Okay, keeping those shifting ideas about the Messiah in mind, how did Jesus' actual life, his ministry, play out? What led up to his crucifixion?
Well, the timeline seems to be around the late 20s AD. Jesus, described sometimes as a carpenter, sometimes as a farmer, starts preaching. He moves around from Galilee down to Jerusalem.
And he talked a lot about the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed. That must have raised eyebrows.
Definitely. That kind of talk would certainly get the attention of the established Jewish elders and authorities.
And he was pretty upfront about claiming to be the Messiah, wasn't he? Which, given the Roman occupation, must have sounded like trouble to both the Romans and the Jewish leadership.
He was, yeah. Sometimes very openly, other times maybe more implicitly. But yes, those claims caused major concern. Both groups feared it could spark a rebellion, a coup attempt. The Romans were always on edge about that kind of thing.
So the Jewish authorities reported him.
That's what the sources suggest, yes. They reported him to the Romans as a potential troublemaker.
Which ultimately led to his arrest and execution.
Correct. The Romans saw him as a potential rebel, a threat to peace and stability. So they arrested him, subjected him to torture, and then crucified him. This likely happened in 30 AD, probably in April.
Okay, but this creates a massive theological hurdle, doesn't it? If Jesus is supposed to be this powerful, even divine figure, how do you explain him being defeated and killed so, well, easily by human authorities?
Yeah.
Especially compared to, say, mythical heroes like Hercules, who performed amazing feats.
That was a huge problem for his early followers, a real sticking point. How could their powerful messiah be killed like a common criminal?
So how do they resolve that?
Well, the reinterpretation began fairly early, in the first few centuries after his death. Early theologians started to argue that Jesus wasn't defeated because he was weak or caught off guard.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they argue he knew exactly what was going to happen. He chose to sacrifice himself. His death wasn't a failure. It was reframed as the ultimate sacrifice.
The sacrifice that allows humanity to reach heaven.
Precisely. It became the act that could grant humanity access to eternal heaven.
And to make that whole idea work better, didn't the concept of original sin get introduced later on? It feels like that provides the why for the sacrifice.
You're absolutely right. The doctrine of original sin basically says that all humans, ever since Adam and Eve, are born inherently sinful. Doesn't matter how good you are, you carry this stain.
Right.
And that inherent sinfulness, according to the doctrine, requires a redeemer, a sacrifice to wash it away. So Jesus' death becomes not just a choice, but a necessary, divinely planned event to fix this fundamental human flaw.
It shows how theological problems can lead to entirely new doctrines to make the narrative fit together.
Exactly. It's about creating a coherent explanation for events that might otherwise seem contradictory within that religious system.
Now, it's becoming clear that many parts of the Jesus story, or at least how they were told, weren't entirely unique. Our sources point out some really striking parallels with other beliefs and rituals common at the time. What are some of the big ones?
Yeah, there are some pretty direct overlaps. Take the communion ritual followers eating bread, drinking wine, symbolizing Jesus' body and blood.
Right, a core Christian practice.
Absolutely.
Right.
But while it was presented as sort of replacing order sacrifices, a very similar ritual using bread and wine or water already existed in faiths like Mithraism.
Mithraism. That was a popular Roman mystery cult, wasn't it?
Very popular, especially among soldiers. And another big one, December 25th, widely celebrated as Jesus' birthday now.
But originally?
Well, December 25th was also the birthday of Mithra, the central figure in Mithraism, and it conveniently coincided with existing winter solstice festivals like Yuletide or the Roman Saturnalia.
Okay, those are pretty significant overlaps. That must have been awkward for the early Christian leaders. How did they explain these similarities without just saying, yeah, we borrowed that?
It definitely put them in a tricky position. They had two main explanations, really. Either they had to admit that parts of Jesus' story were borrowed, compiled from existing traditions, or, as some argued quite forcefully, it was all part of a satanic project.
A satanic project? How does that work?
The idea, heavily pushed by scholars like Eusebius in the early church, was that Satan, being crafty, knew in advance that the Messiah was coming and what the divine events would be.
So Satan created knockoffs beforehand to confuse people.
Precisely. They argued Satan deliberately planted similar stories and rituals in older pagan cultures before the true events happen, specifically to deceive people later on.
Wow.
So things like the fatherless birth motif, which you find in Greek and Egyptian myths, or the story of Moses in the basket, which echoes the much older story of King Sargon.
They just say those are Satan's decoys.
Exactly. The church essentially declared their version the truth, and all the older, similar myths were just demonic counterfeits, even if historical evidence suggested those myths came first.
That's a pretty bold rhetorical strategy. Establish your own authenticity by labeling everything else a fake.
It was powerful. It helped a new religion carve out its unique space and dismiss potentially uncomfortable parallels with older traditions.
Fascinating. Okay, let's dig deeper into the Gospels themselves now, the texts that form the bedrock of the Jesus story for most people. Our sources suggest they're not quite as straightforward or consistent as we might think. What are some of the issues?
Right. Well, let's start with that virgin birth idea again. From a purely historical viewpoint, it's generally considered mythological.
How so?
Consider ancient practices like temple prostitution in Sumeria. Children born from those unions where the father wasn't known were sometimes called children of God. It offers a potential alternative way people at that time might have understood a fatherless birth, very different from our modern interpretation.
Okay. And what about Joseph, Jesus' supposed father? There's some interesting, maybe controversial research about his family background.
Yeah, some 19th century research, like from Godfrey Higgins, he was an antiquarian who did a lot of comparative mythology, quite controversial stuff, suggested Joseph might have belonged to a family group called Panter. Yes, and this group supposedly had links to mystery schools, especially the Essenes. Now, if that's true, it opens up a whole different possibility that maybe Jesus was deliberately trained or even sent out as a kind of project by a specific sect.
Not just a spontaneous figure.
Exactly, more like part of a planned movement.
And then you have figures like Manly P. Hall, the esoteric philosopher. He had his own take on where the real story of Jesus might be found, suggesting it's not really in the Gospels at all.
That's right. Hall believed the true story wasn't in the canonical Gospels, nor even in the apocryphal ones we know about. He thought the clues were scattered in the writings of the early church fathers, the ones writing before the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century.
Before things got standardized, so to speak.
Exactly, before the dogma really solidified. Hall even hinted these truths might be hidden away in vaults of the Brotherhood, suggesting some kind of secret esoteric transmission of knowledge. It makes you wonder what might have been lost or deliberately hidden.
Definitely. And beyond his birth and background, there are even conflicting accounts of his death, right? The crucifixion story isn't the only version out there.
It's really striking. Islam, of course, teaches that Jesus didn't die on the cross, but what's maybe less known is that dozens of apocryphal gospels, many predating Islam, also claim Jesus survived.
Survived the crucifixion.
Some claim he survived, continued preaching, lived to an old age. Irenaeus, a major church father writing around 180 AD, actually cited sources, supposedly from apostles, suggesting Jesus lived well into old age.
Seriously?
Yeah, some accounts claimed he lived to 80, maybe settled in Antioch, even married and had children. The point is, there wasn't just one single narrative about his death circulating early on. There were many competing versions.
Which brings us to this really radical idea you mentioned earlier, the composite Jesus hypothesis. Can you explain that a bit more? What does it mean, and why is it even considered?
Okay, the composite Jesus idea suggests that Jesus might not have been one single historical person. Instead, it could have been a title, or maybe a character, constructed by merging the stories and legends of several similar figures, cult leaders, teachers, prophets who were active in different places around that time.
So like blending multiple biographies into one.
Sort of, yeah. It could help explain why we have so many different names associated with him. Jesus, Yeshua, Yehoshua, Messiah, ha-Messiah, and why there are mentions of many messianic figures popping up in that era. It's a way to make sense of all the seemingly contradictory accounts and profiles.
And this kind of religious fragmentation, the emergence of new leaders, was really fueled by the whole situation with the Roman occupation, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about King Herod. When he took power, he basically secularized Jewish law. He executed nearly 50 members of the Sanhedrin, the main religious council.
Wow, 46 members.
Yeah, and replaced them with younger clergy who were more aligned with Rome. This completely undercut the traditional religious authorities.
Creating a vacuum.
Exactly. It led to this internal fragmentation. Traditional Judaism wasn't functioning like it used to, which pushed different groups to look for new interpretations, new leaders, maybe even a savior in what felt like desperate times.
Now, looking inside the New Testament itself, if you compare the 4 canonical Gospels with Paul's letters, which are actually older, you find some really big differences, some surprising omissions in Paul's writing. Why is that?
It's a critical point. Paul's letters came first, chronologically, but they're missing a lot of the key stories we associate with Jesus from the Gospels.
Like what?
Like the virgin birth, Paul never mentions it. He doesn't say Jesus was from Nazareth. He doesn't specify the trial or crucifixion happened in Jerusalem. He just says Judea. He doesn't call Jesus the Son of Man. And crucially, he doesn't mention Jesus raising the dead, healing the sick, or casting out demons.
On the big miracles.
All the big miracles seem to be absent from Paul's much earlier account. It strongly suggests that these elements were added later as the story developed, that the narrative of Jesus wasn't fixed from the start, but was constructed, maybe embellished, over decades.
Perhaps merging different stories or traditions as it went along?
That's certainly what the composite Jesus hypothesis would suggest. It fits that pattern of an evolving narrative.
And the inconsistencies continue right down to the basic details of his birth, don't they? Even the year seems uncertain.
Yeah, the birth year is a classic example. We often think 0 AD, but that's not really supported. Matthew's gospel places the birth during King Herod's final years, which points to around 4 BC.
Okay.
But Luke's gospel links it to a census under Governor Quirinius of Syria, which happened later in 6 AD.
So a 10-year difference.
At least. Modern scholars usually lean towards 3 or 4 BC. And apparently, early Christians didn't even celebrate on December 25th initially. Some records suggest November 3rd, without a specific year before the later date was adopted. And again, the virgin birth itself, absent from Paul, absent from Mark, absent from John.
And what about that story of Herod killing all the baby boys in Bethlehem? That's such a famous part of the Christmas narrative.
Famous, yes, but historically problematic. Matthew's account of Herod's massacre of the innocents finds zero support in other historical records, including those of Josephus, who wrote extensively about Herod's known cruelties. He doesn't mention it at all.
So likely not a historical event.
It looks much more like a narrative trope. It's almost a direct repeat of the story of Moses, where Pharaoh orders the killing of Hebrew baby boys. You even see similar motifs in Egyptian myths, like Set trying to kill the infant Horus. It's a common literary device to highlight the future hero's importance and miraculous survival.
Establishing the stakes, making the hero special from birth.
Exactly. Powerful storytelling, but maybe not literal history.
And then there's the whole issue with the lineage. If Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, how does that fit with the Jewish requirement for the Messiah to come from King David's line?
That's a major theological knot. Jewish tradition was clear. The Messiah had to be a descendant of David. The Gospels try to establish this link through Joseph.
But if Joseph isn't the biological father?
Then the Davidic lineage through him doesn't hold, biologically speaking. And to complicate it further, Mary is generally identified as being from the tribe of Levi, the priestly line, not David's tribe of Judah.
So from a traditional Jewish perspective at the time, that would have been a huge problem for accepting him as the Messiah.
A very significant obstacle, yes. He wouldn't meet one of the key prophetic requirements.
It really seems like the nature of the Gospels themselves, how they were written, passed down, which ones were chosen, fuels this whole idea of inconsistency and maybe a composite figure.
Absolutely. Think about it. Our New Testament is based on 4 Gospels plus Paul's letters, 5 main textual traditions, really, and each is made up of many fragments pieced together over time.
And none of them are contemporary eyewitness accounts.
No. The earliest surviving manuscripts we have are from long after Jesus would have lived. There are no texts definitively from his actual lifetime. And we know many, many other Christian writings existed Gospels, Acts, letters that were later labeled apocryphal, Gnostic, or heretical.
And suppressed.
Suppressed, burned, altered by the emerging Orthodox Church. For instance, the oldest tiny scrap believed to be from Matthew's Gospel is dated around 110 AD. Just a few letters, doesn't even have Matthew's name on it. And by 100 AD, we know of at least 10 other Gospels circulating besides the 4 that made it into the canon.
Like the Gospel of Thomas or Judas.
Gospel of Thomas, Truth, Peter, Judas, Mary, many others. A whole spectrum of different perspectives on Jesus existed early on.
So when you pull all that together, the sheer number of accounts, the conflicting details, the timing, the unlikelihood of poor communities suddenly writing and mass copying dozens of complex books right after his death, does the composite Jesus idea start to seem more logical?
It certainly becomes a more coherent way to explain the data we have, given all the variations, the contradictions, the different profiles, concluding that Jesus might represent a compilation of multiple figures, or perhaps the symbolic cult leader archetype promoted by various groups across different regions. It makes the disorganized, contradictory nature of the evidence make more sense.
Rather than assuming one single person generated all these wildly different stories simultaneously.
Exactly. The composite theory suggests maybe powerful groups, elites perhaps, either fabricated a figure or, more likely, merged existing stories and historical accounts, shaping the narrative to fit their agenda. It implies a level of historical manipulation.
It's a heavy implication.
It is. It challenges foundational assumptions.
Okay, this deep dive definitely needs to touch on the influence of those Jewish mystery cults and Gnosticism. They seem intertwined with this evolving story. How should we understand Gnosticism in this context? Were there different kinds?
Yeah, it's good to differentiate. There was a kind of classic Jewish Gnosticism that developed earlier, influenced by the Talmud and other mythologies.
Okay.
Then you have Christian Gnosticism, which really emerged in the 2nd century AD. It was more of a blend, the syncretism of early Christian ideas with various pagan beliefs and philosophies. Our understanding of this second type really exploded after 1945 with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt.
Those lost Gnostic texts.
Exactly. They gave us direct access to writings we only knew about secondhand before, often from critics who condemned them.
And these Gnostic figures, the leaders and thinkers, they sound pretty mythical themselves in the accounts we have, almost like characters from a fantasy novel.
Some of them, absolutely. You hear about figures like the alchemist Basilides and Sean, or Simon Magus, who even gets a mention in the Bible's Book of Acts. The stories about them often involve things like flying chariots, magical battles, healing by touch, surviving fire. Very dramatic, very mythical stuff.
So in that kind of environment, Jesus would almost have to be presented as superhuman, wouldn't he?
It fits the cosmology, yes. Within that Gnostic framework, for Jesus to be the central messianic figure, he needed to operate on that same elevated, mythical, superhuman level. It was almost an expectation.
It sounds like ancient religions often had different layers, something for the general public and something deeper, more esoteric for initiates.
That's a very common pattern across ancient cultures and empires. You'd often have the public state religion, the rituals everyone participated in, and then alongside that, or perhaps woven within it, an elite tradition for philosophers, mystics, alchemists, people exploring deeper questions about reality, immortality, esoteric knowledge.
Like different levels of understanding.
Kind of like in Islamic Sufism, where you have the Avam, general public, and the Havas, the elect, the initiates, with different depths of teaching.
And these more elite or heretical groups often faced persecution, didn't they? How does that connect back to the fragmented picture of Jesus we're discussing?
They absolutely faced suppression. Think of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. He actively persecuted many of these so-called heretical groups, destroying texts, shutting down schools, forcing them underground.
So the knowledge didn't necessarily vanish, it just got hidden.
Often, yes. Some see traditions like Freemasonry as inheriting symbols and rituals from these suppressed Jewish mystery schools. This history of persecution and secrecy helps explain why some Gnostic sources seem contradictory, or why the profiles of Jesus are so varied. Sources were lost, interpretations became fragmented, traditions went underground and evolved in secret.
So suppression doesn't erase history, it just makes it messier and harder to piece together.
Precisely. It scatters the pieces, forcing us to reconstruct from fragments and hints.
Okay, let's turn to one specific group often linked to Jesus, the Essenes. They sound like a really fascinating community. What do our sources tell us about who they were and what they did?
The Essenes are definitely a key group in these discussions, especially over the last century or so. The name itself, Essene, seems related to an Aramaic word for healer.
Healers.
Primarily, they seem to have had two main branches, The practici, who focused on crafts, farming, taking care of the community's physical needs, and the therapeutae, who were the healers, the doctors, the ones most associated with the term Essenes.
Were they just healers?
Not entirely. Some were apparently also known as astrologers or prophets. King Herod himself reportedly consulted an Essene prophet at one point.
Interesting. And their daily practices. Do they sound familiar in relation to the gospel accounts of Jesus?
Very familiar in some ways. Key characteristics mentioned for both Essene groups include spending hours each day in meditation.
Okay.
And apparently they often communicated using riddles or parables, which of course sounds a lot like how Jesus is depicted teaching in the Gospels.
And Jesus also spent hours in prayer and meditation, according to the Gospels.
Exactly. Those parallels in the parables are why many esoteric writers have claimed Jesus was an Essene priest, or at least received training from them. They see a direct connection. So, this raises the possibility that things interpreted as miracles, healings, maybe even raising the dead, could have been something else.
That's the theory some propose. They suggest that what looked like supernatural healing might have actually been advanced medical knowledge for the time. Remember, in antiquity, illness was often blamed on evil spirits or divine displeasure.
So a skilled healer might seem like a miracle worker.
Exactly. The line between a doctor and a magician could be pretty blurry in people's minds back then. So advanced Essene medical skills could easily have been interpreted as miracles.
And what about their core beliefs? Did they differ from mainstream Judaism at the time, especially regarding the afterlife?
Significantly. The Essenes apparently believed the physical body was just a temporary shell. The real person was the soul, which lived on after death in another realm, either a heaven or a hell.
So they really emphasized the afterlife.
They did. They seem to have been key in introducing more developed, sophisticated ideas about life after death into Jewish thought, ideas that later became central to Christianity.
And they were known for being pretty strict, weren't they? Especially about honesty.
Yes, Josephus, the historian, wrote about them. He noted they were incredibly strict about keeping their word. If an Essene broke an oath, they could be expelled from the community. It highlights how much they valued trustworthiness.
Where were these communities based? And where did the Essenes originally come from?
Well, 19th century scholars like Edward Ewer identified two main centers. One was near the Dead Sea in Palestine, around Engaddi. The other was in Egypt, near Lake Moris.
Egypt and Palestine.
As for origins, some traditions link them to the prophet Samuel, but the general scholarly view leans towards origins in Egypt or maybe further east. There are even reports that Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher, studied with them in Egypt centuries earlier.
Wow. And their internal structure, their hierarchy. Does that echo anything familiar?
It's quite striking, actually. Both the Palestinian and Egyptian groups seem to have had a similar structure and rules. They held an annual gathering, a ritual called Hadut for initiations and promotions.
And the hierarchy.
It apparently consisted of three main levels. Rabbin, meaning master or father, Rabbi, the assistant or son, and Rab, an assistant scholar, sometimes associated with the Holy Spirit.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That sounds incredibly close to the Christian Trinity.
The resemblance is uncanny, isn't it? It certainly makes you wonder about potential influences or shared roots.
And getting into this group, becoming a full member, it wasn't easy.
No, it was a serious long-term commitment. Sources suggest you had to serve as a novice for 13 years before you could even begin formal training. It's reminiscent of Pythagoras' school, where students reportedly had to serve for 5 years before they could even meet him.
A long apprenticeship. Now, there are theories connecting Jesus' initiation, even Christian baptism, directly to Essene practices.
Yes, writers like Manly P. Hall speculated Jesus might have been initiated at the same mystery temple, the Kuzadek Temple, where Pythagoras supposedly trained centuries before. And Robert Cheney, a 20th century mystic, went further, claiming Christian baptism itself originated from Essene baptismal rites, likely passed on through Jesus.
And John the Baptist, the one who baptized Jesus in the Jordan River. Where does he fit into these Essene theories?
Esotericists often propose that John the Baptist was also an Essene, and that he was deliberately sent out first kind of to prepare the way, to lay the groundwork for Jesus' appearance.
So this leads back to that Essene project idea that Jesus' emergence wasn't just random or purely divine, but maybe orchestrated by the sect.
That's the core of the theory, that the Essenes, seeking influence, planned and managed Jesus' arrival. Some versions even suggest they sent out multiple potential Messiah figures, prototypes, to different regions, and perhaps their stories later got combined into the single figure of Jesus we know.
So the Essene project theory offers this alternative origin, viewing it less as divine intervention and more as a calculated human-driven effort by a powerful, maybe secretive group.
Exactly. It frames it as a strategic move by an influential sect.
And there are even stranger claims, like the Essenes being able to fake death. How does that tie in?
Yeah, there are reports or theories suggesting they had knowledge of how to control bodily functions, slow the pulse, basically feign death. This has led some to speculate that maybe Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but used this knowledge to appear dead. It's a plot point used in the movie The Man from Earth, for example.
But that sounds like it could easily slide into conspiracy territory.
It does. You have to be cautious. Similar claims of feigning death or having secret knowledge were made about many figures in antiquity. If you accept them all at face value, you end up with this grand conspiracy where all prophets and major figures were secretly trained by hidden sects. It becomes hard to separate plausible theory from speculation.
Right. Need to keep a level head. So what eventually happened to the Essenes? They were influential, maybe had this secret knowledge. Why aren't they a major force today?
Well, they seem to have peaked in popularity around, say, 70 BC. But as tensions rose between various Jewish groups and the Roman authorities, Rome started cracking down on any powerful, potentially independent sects. The Essenes got caught up in this general suppression.
But they managed to save some of their teachings. You mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes. Crucially, before they were fully suppressed or scattered, they hid many of their important scrolls and texts, burying them in jars and caves, most famously near Qumran by the Dead Sea. Those scrolls, rediscovered centuries later, date roughly from 300 BC to 70 BC.
So they weren't totally wiped out, but went underground or scattered.
It seems so. They weren't eradicated completely. Surviving members likely continued their traditions in secret, keeping a low profile, maybe until Christianity started to gain traction.
And the theory is these scattered survivors might have continued the project.
Some theorize that these dispersed Essenes might have independently trained their own messiah figures in different areas. This could be another explanation for why similar names and narratives cropped up in various places, further supporting that composite Jesus idea.
And those Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, what do they tell us specifically about Essene beliefs relevant to Jesus?
The Qumran discoveries were huge. They confirmed the Essenes had a very strong expectation of a messiah or maybe multiple messianic figures around that time. And fascinatingly, many passages, visions, and stories found in the Christian book of Revelation.
Attributed to John.
Right. They turned out to be remarkably similar to, or in some cases directly drawn from, texts found at Qumran, particularly the book of Enoch.
The book of Enoch. An Essene text.
Yes, an important text for them. It describes the prophet Enoch's journey to heaven, his visions of the afterlife, themes that echo strongly in Revelation and also pop up in the Torah and even the Quran. It shows a clear link in apocalyptic ideas.
So it almost seems like, in a strange way, the Essenes got the last laugh. Their ideas, suppressed by Rome, eventually resurfaced and became central to the religion that took over the Roman Empire.
You could definitely frame it that way. Essene ideology, or at least elements very similar to it, reemerged powerfully within Gnostic Christianity and then influenced mainstream Christianity as it became the official religion of the empire. It's like their ideas achieved a kind of posthumous revenge against the powers that tried to stamp them out.
A testament to how suppressed ideas can endure and eventually reshape the mainstream.
It really is. It shows the long, often hidden currents of influence in history.
Wow. Okay. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. What a journey. From looking at how the idea of a Messiah even developed, to exploring the possibility of a composite Jesus, and digging into the influence of groups like the Essenes.
It really paints a much more complex, multi-layered picture than the traditional narrative, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Hopefully for you listening, you feel like you've gained a really comprehensive, nuanced perspective. We've tried to move beyond just the standard story and explore these deeper currents of history, mythology, textual criticism.
It's not just about listing facts, right? It's about connecting the dots, seeing how these stories were formed, how they changed, and how they continue to shape culture.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. What does all this really mean for how we understand any deeply ingrained narrative and just how powerful interpretation can be? If the story of Jesus, as we commonly know it, was potentially shaped, layered, maybe even constructed over centuries, What other major historical figures or core beliefs might also be composite identities or projected narratives shaped by later agendas?
It really makes you question the nature of historical truth itself, doesn't it? Especially when that truth is filtered through generations of human experience, power dynamics, and ever-evolving understanding. Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about.